Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Very honored, as always. All of us are who are part of this team. It's great to have you. It's amazing that all of you are intrigued or interested in learning about the Bible and how God is working in and through humans. And I'm really flattered by that. It's a deep passion for me, and I'm always excited when people come alongside and want to dig deeper and have conversation about it. Oh, sorry. So really great to have you here. First things first, most of you are level grounders anyway, so you know where to go pee. But if you don't, it's right out that door to the right. Straight out the door, basically, is the women's bathroom. The men's bathroom is just slightly to the right, and then on the left in the hallway, you'll find the signs there. And so there's that. We also want this space to be a safe space on multiple levels. One being COVID exposure, so we really appreciate if you have your mask on at all times. That just reduces the risk and makes everybody more comfortable. And so we thank you to bear with us in that way. It's not necessarily comfortable for ourselves, but we thank you that you bear the burden for everybody. And another level, we also want this to be a safe space for discussion. And we want to make space for disagreement as well. I do believe disagreement can be very important and very life-giving in a discussion, as long as the discussion can be cordial and it can be respectful. I am by no means an expert, and I think neither Moni or Christian would be one called an expert. We don't know it all, we don't know everything, but we are passionate about something that we know something about, something that we have learned and that we would like to share. So that's why we're here. Thank you for coming. Who is up for opening tonight with a prayer? I could do that, but I speak so much tonight, so you'll be tired of me. Thank you, Christian.
Father God, I say thank you for this evening. Thank you for this space and this opportunity to come together, to set some time aside and just learn about you and learn about the Bible. We want to say thank you for the Bible and for the words that you have given to us. I say also thank you for Ronald and for the effort and the work he's put into tonight and to preparing. And I just pray that you would empower him with your spirit to teach us truth, to help us understand you better through his teachings. And I pray that you prepare all of our hearts and minds for what you have in store. Amen.
Amen. Okie dokie. So we have a few new people. Can I single you out? How many new hands do we have? 1, 2. Oh, that's almost half the people. So that's substantial, which makes my job a little bit more difficult because I want to try to tie in a little bit of last time so you know where we've been. Who of the new people have seen last session on YouTube? Because we have the announcement is not very large in a newsletter, but it was announced there that we did upload it, so nobody did. All right, so that means we'll cover the basics of last time before we then go into today. So basically, our goal is to read the Bible as good as we can. And that includes doing all we can to understand it the best we can, right? So we don't want to leave anything out. We want to take everything into consideration that could be helpful. And that, for example, includes archaeology. And we will talk about that in a little bit. We will review a little bit of what we had covered last time. But basically, there can be many assumptions about the Bible and what the Bible exactly is. And one assumption can be, this is a bit caricature, so it's a bit pulled far in one direction, but one driving assumption can be that the Bible is a divine product, either mainly a divine product or solely a divine product, and it's basically dictated from heaven, something like supernatural knowledge that God infuses in people, maybe in some kind of trance, and that then kind of leads into that we read the Bible in a very flat manner because everything is equally supernatural. It's equally perhaps dictated by God. Then an opposing opinion or opposing assumption can be that the Bible is merely a human product. It's entirely human. It's only, some old documents some people have written. It's probably all, or most of it, might be fictional. So it's interesting, but nothing more. And what we want to promote is actually a balanced view between the two that recognizes that, yes, this is a human product. It is written in a human language. It records human experiences, and it addresses human needs at the time of writing. But, big but, also, it is also a divine product in the sense that it follows God's interventions in human history. So it's not just interested in, what humans did way back when. It is mainly interested in what God has done. But it does that from the human perspective. It discerns God's intentions as well, and the human nature, the human heart, we might say. And those two can be in conflict. That's kind of the plot of the Bible, if we want to put it that way. And the message transcends its temporal placement, let's say, which means even though it is written to an audience in a given space and time, at the time of writing, the message that there is, we believe, has value today. In which way? There's a lot of discussion that can be had. How much does it influence us today? How much should it influence us today? But that it influences us today is kind of, if we are a Christian, that's kind of goes without saying. So that balanced view takes a lot of work, because now we have to hold both of these in tension. We cannot just assume, well, it's just people writing something, but we also can't just dismiss that and say this is only God. There's not a single trace of human being in here, which is very hard to hold. There's a lot of humanness to the Bible, and that's kind of the goal of last session and this session as well, also the next session, kind of highlighting the human element, the human sphere of the Bible. And I believe personally that is very encouraging, because it tells me that God works in and through humans. He decides to do his ministry, his work in humans. And he is patient enough to do that, which I wouldn't be, to be honest. But he is. He chooses to do that. So, with that covered, that's kind of the baseline that we covered last time. Let's go into some PowerPoint. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to consider all the tools that we have available to understand the Bible the best we can. And one very important tool is science. In a broad scheme, more particular, we might actually consider archaeology. In archaeology, even science itself is a relatively new thing. So we have only done organized science following the scientific method for about 200 years, perhaps a little more, give or take. And it's not like, there was a moment in time when, now we start to do science. Somebody invented science. No, it came about. And just like that, also, archaeology came about. And it was not very sophisticated in its day. And we will see, we'll compare a little bit what archaeology used to be like 200 years ago with what it is today. So ancient cultures were mostly unknown. We knew of some of them, perhaps mentioned in the Bible, but mostly they were buried in the ground. There was very little that we knew about them. Excavations didn't really happen at all. It was more so if we find something interesting of the past, it's because we stumbled across it. And then it's, this is cool. But there was no organized excavations or specific searching for something. Hieroglyphs, so the Egyptian form of writing, we'll come across that more today, was known, partly because, we see inscriptions like these in the pyramids. They're kind of hard to hide, but they weren't deciphered. Nobody knew what they are, what they meant. Same for Mesopotamian, Babylonian inscriptions. This is called cuneiform, basically a clay tablet, and you take a stick and you press shapes into it. This was also known already at the time, but it wasn't deciphered. Nobody could read it. There was no extra biblical, to me this is a big one, there was no extra biblical Hebrew writing at all. And that then led some people to assume, well, if there's no Hebrew outside the Bible, then maybe Hebrew is this kind of very special, maybe even an angelic or divine language. That was the entire purpose of Hebrew was the Bible. That was the only purpose this language would have. So you see already that even that assumption, or perhaps conclusion, we might say, draws or comes already into one of these extremes where this is mostly a divine product. That's kind of the necessary assumption to think like that. But, if there's no other Hebrew, then it is kind of different to all the other languages. The location of most biblical places was unknown. And the Old Testament is really the only source of knowledge about the very ancient past. So let's say the classical period, Greeks, Romans, and so on, lots of extra biblical sources. All these Greek philosophers and all this stuff that you read, obviously that was there. But before that, anything that goes, let's say, 1,000 years before Christ, there wasn't really anything other than the Bible, which then automatically leads to, well, if this is the only source we have, then I guess that's what it was, right? I mean, that's what we would do. If you only have one source, then we have to kind of assume that that's it. It must have been like that. And we take it as history, and then later that can be challenged. And yes, that was basically the point there. So what is archaeology today by comparison? Very different. A ton of ancient cultures we know today, and we still uncover more and more where we maybe thought, oh, this was the same people, the same old culture. We actually realize, oh, this is actually two separate people, things like that. And we even, we might find more sites, more cities, and so on, buried in the dirt than we knew before. So lots happening. Here's an excavation, an organized excavation. There's even shelter. There's a roof on top of it, so it doesn't damage any of the findings, any of whatever is being dug up. So large-scale excavations. Millions and millions of dollars go into that. And that in itself already, when you start talking that amount of money, becomes a bit problematic. Because archaeology can be, we can call it weaponized archaeology. Because as any other thing in science, we can try and use it to prove a point. Either to prove or disprove a point. And so archaeology can be done with the particular intention to prove or disprove something. Hieroglyphs have been deciphered, so now we can read ancient Egyptian, which is fun. Cuneiform has been deciphered, and we don't just have some of these clay tablets, we have about 1 million of them. So that's a ton of literature from 3,000 years ago. And we do have extra biblical Hebrew now, so we know, it's not an angelic language, an extraterrestrial language, so-called, after all. So it was a normal language that people would speak. Most biblical places have been identified. Archaeology, more than just occasional finds, is now a constant stream of new information, just like any other field in science. There's constantly new discoveries, new conclusions. When you think of archaeology, the actual digging up of things is the smallest part, really. It's maybe the most arduous work, perhaps, because there's a lot of dirt and not very much to find most of the time. But a lot of the actual heavy lifting happens after that, because how do we make sense of what we find? And we have to be very meticulous and very careful to date these things in their particular order and the particular layers of dirt that they have been found and so on and so forth. So that takes a lot of time and a lot of peer review, cross-examining that we're doing good work, just like any other scientific branch. And yeah, so it is scientific. And by definition, God isn't necessarily part of the equation. Science, as such, just taking dry science, God doesn't really fit in there. And to us Christians, sometimes it can be a problem. It feels like a problem, but it doesn't really have to be. Because science is not supposed to explain it is what God has done, necessarily. As Christians, we can draw perhaps such conclusions, but they are never backed by science, because God in itself is a huge assumption. And science always tends to the explanation that has the fewest and the smallest assumptions. Just like we would, why does it rain? Well, nowadays we don't say because Peter has, spilling some water in heaven. We say, we have observed these things, we have measured these things, we have tested these things, and now we say the explanation with the fewest assumptions is actually that water evaporates, and we have the circle of water, for example, right? So the fewest assumptions is where science will go. Now, what happens when the archaeology doesn't square with the biblical account of things? The Bible says, here's an event that happened, maybe, but here's a story, and archaeology doesn't quite square with that, doesn't quite look like that actually happened like that. What do we do with that? Now, there are many ways we can react to it. One of them is fighting it. And I believe for myself, this is usually the first reaction I go to. If there's either scientific in general, but specifically if it is archaeology that seems to disprove something that the Bible says, especially if it's something that we consider has to be historical or anything, I want to fight it. I want to discredit, whoever made that conclusion, and I want to, there must be a different explanation, and if there isn't, well, then this must be a scheme of the enemy to, discourage Christians or something. That's one option. Another option, maybe we just want to drop everything and say, you know what, I guess it was all a hoax anyway, talking donkey. What was I thinking, right? Talking snake, I guess it was all a myth anyway. It wasn't true. So, I guess I'll just let go of Christianity altogether. And the third option, you might be familiar with this triad of fight, flight, or freeze. But I think freeze isn't really helpful. So I came up with my own triad, which is fight, flight, or insight. And I believe that is the most prudent, the most helpful option to go. And that is hard work, again. It's oftentimes also emotional work to take this new discovery and this new scientific finding and take it to God and be like, can you help me understand this? Can you help me make sense of this? And perhaps, just like any other thing in science, the whole point of science is not that, this is strict knowledge. This cannot be ever challenged. No, science is less about knowledge. It is more a tool. So it is a tool to, carve out knowledge. But the whole point of it is that we can challenge that and that we can try and understand better. And perhaps there is a better explanation. But again, a better explanation will be fewer assumptions, not more. Am I holding this wrong the whole time? All right. I try, okay. So, yes, maybe fighting is an option, but first we should seek insight. First, we should go to God and be, perhaps there is a way of, perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps my assumption of what this passage meant or what this passage is supposed to be, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this wasn't supposed to be a historical writing down of what exactly happened on day X or Y. Maybe this is actually a story that is supposed to teach me something, rather than tell me about events. You with me so far? Cool. So now that we have covered this, and we want to try and invite insight, and invite God to bring us insight, now let's, last time we dug into Babylonian history and culture a little bit. So tonight that's going to be Egyptian, 90% Egyptian, a tiny little bit of Canaanite. And that's because Canaanite is very small in comparison to Egyptian and Mesopotamian or Babylonian, because usually that strip of land in Canaan would be a battleground between the larger empires. So it would swing from side to side. Swing states. There you go. So a lot of what is produced there culturally is really an offspring of the larger empires. So today, Egypt. Tonight, I start the PowerPoint a little bit different. So this is your timeline. So we're going way back. So 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC. That's a long time ago. Egypt, the Egyptian history can basically be divided into three periods of big growth and big strength. And those are called the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdom periods. And you see there's gaps in this story. So they need to be filled with intermediate periods. And those intermediate periods were times of relative weakness and division in Egypt. And then we have the bookends. We have early dynastic periods and the late period. All right. So the early dynastic period is basically where Egypt first got united. And Egypt has a long history of basically being two larger regions, Upper and Lower Egypt. And on the map there you can see Lower Egypt is actually up on the map. That's because it's lower geographically. It's just like the Fraser Valley. The Lower Fraser is actually by the ocean, right? Upper Fraser in the mountains. Same here. Upper and Lower Egypt, and there's always times when they don't get along very well, these two larger regions. But Pharaoh Menes was the first one to unite the two, and we can see in the picture up above that there's, on the left side, we have the crown of Upper Egypt, on the right side, the crown of Lower Egypt, and he gets them both. So he is basically, he's the king of both. He's the uniter of the two worlds. And hieroglyphs are established as the main writing form throughout Egypt at this time. The kingship is assumed to be divine. Very important in those days that you have your credentials. People can sadly not really backcheck, but you claim, I am king not because I'm a great guy, but because, either I'm descendant of a divine being or a divine patron or whatever has assigned kingship to me. And nobody can argue with that. Just maybe like today when people say, God said, it's hard to argue with that. Big emphasis on order throughout Egyptian history. But it is a little bit different to Mesopotamia. I mean, if you remember last time we talked Mesopotamia, lots of chaos. Always, there's a lot of small periods where different regions became the center of power. Most of the time it was Babylon, but not always. And that has probably to do with the fact that the Euphrates and Tigris rivers flood a lot, but very unpredictably. So sometimes the flood would be really good for the harvest and everything, but sometimes it would be really destructive, and then thus weakening a certain city or city-state or empire center of power, and a different one would take over. So there's always a struggle to actually obtain order the whole time, because disorder always creeps in. In Egypt, it's a little bit different. The Nile is also a flooding river. I guess most rivers would be, but some are more than others. But the Nile is very gentle and very, very predictable in its flooding. So the season's much more predictable. And that's also why in Egypt you have rarely an occasion where different people groups within Egypt would grab power. Although the center of power does move around a little bit, but nothing like Mesopotamia. So very much a much more organized, much more civilized, much more tranquil place, if you want. So that perhaps then plays also into their literature and just into their worldview, because chaos in this case is something that it's all about maintaining order rather than establishing it in the first place. It is assumed. Order is kind of assumed, and then it's all about just the maintaining that. All right, and interesting there, belief in the afterlife. It's actually somewhat unique. In Babylon, this is not really as much a thing. It's more like the idea is I live on through my descendants, whereas in Egypt has always been an understanding of an afterlife. So that's an interesting distinction as well between Egypt and Babylon. Then we have the Old Kingdom, and this is where the heavy hitters come in. Already way back then, it's about 2,500 years ago, when the big pyramids of Gizeh were built. The largest one is called the Khufu pyramid, but it's not the oldest one actually. The oldest one is the one in the picture above. That's the Djoser pyramid. Why is this sometimes louder than other times? I always scare myself. So there was this time when pyramids were built, and there's probably multiple reasons to that, not just a single one. One is that in their mythology, creation happened in sort of a creation mound. And out of this mound, life is formed, again, divine interplay, but it centers around this creation mound. So this is probably supposed to be a depiction of that, a symbol to that. But also, most definitely tombs, because we have found many sarcophagi in there and old pharaohs that look grumpy. And also, I can't go too much into detail, but actually one of the pharaohs, anyways, describes it as a stairway to heaven. I don't know who of you is familiar with the story of Jacob, but that perhaps rings a little bit of a bell, because in the same or very similar to Jacob, here the stairway to heaven is supposed to connect this person with God, and then there is agents going up and down the staircase. So very interesting imagery there. Then we have the first intermediate period. So now we had this rise in order and in power and in wealth perhaps, and then there's the first decline. Loss of confidence in the centralized power, and the pharaohs, the local rulers, rise up and get more powerful. Famine is a thing. So the one time when the river doesn't flood as expected, there's drought, there's famine. And again, Upper and Lower Egypt split, Next, we have the Middle Kingdom. So again, we're on the incline again. It gets more orderly. Somebody reunites both kingdoms. That's Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. And now, interestingly, the pharaohs explain themselves as good shepherds rather than these divine rulers. They still consider themselves as being divinely appointed, but now as managers, let's say. So that's and actually the word shepherd is a quite interesting one in this context. And temples are now no longer built out in the open field in the form of pyramids, but now they are built on mountainsides. As you can see here, there's like a cliff, and you have a temple basically built next to it, but actually much of the temple goes inside, so it's carved out of the mountainside. And the one here, the larger one in front that you see, is actually not from this period, is actually newer. The one that sits behind, that is the smaller one, that's a temple that comes out of this Middle Kingdom period. The newer one in front was built by a female pharaoh. Name escapes me now. But, you can see clearly the signs of a shopping mall. No, that was a very bad joke. So, and we progress in Egypt's history. Again, we hit one of these intermediate periods. Again, decline, turmoil, division. But now, also we have a ton of immigrants. And immigrants, they have always been a thing, as it turns out. And Cush, you may be familiar with the Cushites in the Bible. They don't come up very often, but they did exist. And they were actually a southern Egyptian people who then take over control of Upper Egypt. As you can see on the map, the brown, those are the Cushites. They take over southern Egypt, which is Upper Egypt. And the north is being taken over by the Hyksos, which means the foreign rulers, which is quite interesting. So you have people come in and eventually take control, actually, of Lower Egypt. And this roughly coincides with the arrival of Joseph. Except Joseph wasn't alone. As it turns out, there was a lot of immigrants. Interestingly, in the lower, these two other images here, the left one is quite prominent oftentimes in magazines or, whatever book covers. A very well-known image. It's encased, I believe, in a sarcophagus, but also in that sarcophagus is the image in the middle, which seems to depict Semitic people. So not Egyptian people, but Semitic or Hebrew people. Possibly. It's not quite clear, but it's possible. However, those images actually date from a prior period. So I fooled you all. So here is again, weaponized archaeology. Some will now push to make the Hebrews, to make it prove a certain story in the Bible, whereas others try to be as honest as possible with the numbers and the scientific data, and then say, well, it could be, but it is definitely earlier. It doesn't fit let's say, a traditional timeline. Then, again, upswing, new kingdom. There is a pharaoh that expels the Hyksos, these foreign rulers, again, establishes Egyptian power. Pharaoh Ahmose, interestingly, establishes monotheism. So that, it turns out, is not something that is unique to the Bible, even though it is special, because the Bible is very much about monotheism. But it's not entirely unique to the Bible. There were also other nations, and in this case, even Egypt had a phase where monotheism was being pushed. So for those who maybe are not familiar with that language, monotheism meaning one God. So that's quite interesting. And he changes his name to Akhenaten. That this one God was called Authen, and he changed his name to the living spirit of Authen. So very interesting story there. And this is some building stuff out of that time. On the left, again, you see a temple built into the mountainside. So that trend was still in, even hundreds of years later. Trends lasted longer. To the right, that is Akhenaten, a bust of him. But beneath, we have a carving of him and his wife, Nefertiti, who were the only allowed priests to that god. So it was a very centralized religion in that sense. We need to talk about the Exodus. And there's a lot we could cover. We could make a whole series just on the Exodus because there's a ton to talk about. It roughly fits into this time frame. But there is an early date and there is a late date. And the early date is based on a traditional timeline, let's say. So if we consider all the ages of people in the Bible to be exact and accurate, and them being historical people, and we do the math and go back, that roughly goes to 1440 BC. And there's also a proposed late date, which seems to be more so backed up by the archaeological data. So between Christians even, there's a lot of debate, which one is it, or is it even something else entirely? But there's these two dates that are being thrown around a lot. But the whole thing is very, very complex. None of these dates can be proven unequivocally. There's scientific data that goes for and against it. But the larger picture really that we should get out of this period and out of perhaps the theme of Exodus is there was a ton of immigration over a longer period of time, and then there was emigration, so people going out over a shorter period of time, and that was happening in more or less dramatic ways. So the Israelites, if we take them as a nation like that, were not the only ones in Egypt, and they were not the only ones leaving Egypt. Perhaps they were some of the more dramatic people to leave Egypt, but they were not the only ones. So perhaps we can even speak about more than one Exodus. I don't know if there's a plural, exodi, or something, but that was more so something that happened to Egypt over a period of time. Now, what I find interesting is the early date of the Exodus predates Akhenaten, the monotheistic pharaoh, and the late date postdates him. So that, to me, opens the question, did perhaps a people inspire him? Did immigrants into Egypt inspire this pharaoh to become monotheistic, such as perhaps the Hebrews? Or was it in turn, did he inspire people to become monotheistic? So there's an interesting debate to be had. What you're looking at here in the pictures, on the right side is the so-called Marinepta Stella. So Stella is basically like a monument that pharaohs or kings would put up to record what they have done. And usually it would stand exactly where something happened. And in this case, this is the earliest mentioning of Israel outside of the Bible. Dates to about 1200 before Christ. And the little blurb down there it basically says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. So here's a military victory. The whole thing is a document about a military campaign by this pharaoh, and he went and has wiped out many peoples, and among them he lists Israel. So very interesting that this is the first time Israel pops up in archaeology at all, or in history outside of the Bible. Cool. You have the third intermediate period, so again, downswing, division between upper and lower Egypt, again, as always. But now it seems to be terminal, because now Egypt loses control of Canaan and the Syrian areas, which are to its northeast. And Egypt used to be always, in some way, shape, or form, be in power over that landmass, or at least have those, like any rulers in that area, pay taxes to Egypt. So they would have some kind of influence basically throughout, but now they are kicked out eventually entirely by the Assyrian Empire. And in between, they had large struggles with the Hittites, and we'll come to that a bit later. And here you see roughly 1200 and onward is that basically sits in the New Kingdom, but from the New Kingdom onwards there is a period of time that is in archaeology called the Late Bronze Collapse. And there's a lot of mystery around this because Egypt is rapidly declining. It hangs on by barely. In Babylon, there is an entire slump in power, fits into between two larger empires. Basically, it's just before the Assyrians take over, and those are the ones who kick out Egypt out of Canaan. And it's not very well known what happened in this period of time. Why there was a general loss in power and then influence in the larger empires. So they both collapse basically at the same time. And, even if we have millions of tablets of cuneiform and lots of hieroglyphs, so far we don't have anything specific that tells us what exactly happened. There's likely a combination of many, many factors. Among them, something like migrations of people that came from other parts of the Mediterranean, perhaps around the Greek islands, such as the Philistines, who settle around this time in the area of Canaan, and are warrior people like nothing else, and they disrupt the whole region quite a bit. And they seem to have a Greek influence in them. So it's perhaps they came from the north, disrupt the scene. Climate change, definitely an option. Just climatic conditions change. Crop yields are not what they used to be, but now on a regular basis, rather than, you have the odd bad year, now it starts to become the pattern. Natural disasters. We know that there was a volcanic eruption, a significant one around this time. Earthquakes do happen somewhat frequently in the entire region. We have economic systems can collapse, and I guess to some extent we have lived through that as well about 12 years ago, and maybe we're always a bit on edge because through COVID maybe that happens again, who knows. But also there can just be a ton of revolt among people that just kind of have enough of things and want to do their own thing. So probably a combination of all of these and more factors that caused larger empires to lose power and influence. At the same time, we have lots of small settlements popping up in Canaan, new settlements that haven't been there before, and apparently of cultures that weren't there before, or at least they were somewhat different. And in that sense, that corroborates to an extent that new people moved into Canaan, either that or people that were already in Canaan moved into different regions and started new settlements. Perhaps it could be explained if there's a ton of people who revolt against some kind of military leader or some chieftain, and they move and start their own things up in the mountains. Interestingly, hill country. The hill country isn't really the best region to settle in. Most the larger groups of people, even within Canaan, they had different spaces that are more suitable for settling. They're easier to defend and so on. Now, these people would start to settle in the hill country, which seems to be, that's the only space that was left. And yeah, it's a good question. There's no specific evidence to point out, this was an invasion, it was a military campaign. There's some evidence that would suggest that, but there's also evidence that would suggest, no, this might just have been an infiltration, or even people from within. So no conclusive, from a scientific point of view, no conclusive answer there. And that was the end of the PowerPoint. So lots of archaeology, lots of history about Egypt. And I should have said this before. I will say it now. I don't expect any of you to memorize any of that. Or to, if I ask you now, what period was the Middle Kingdom? When did it start? When did it end? Forget about it. It's not about that. It's more so about giving you a bit of a taste, a bit of an impression of what Egypt was like. And I think that is more important than any exact data, for us anyway, as followers of Jesus. It's interesting to go, if we have the inclination, totally dig into it and, do science as a Christian, right? But for us today, the important thing is gaining a perspective. And one thing that immediately stuck out to me is when we talk about the Exodus, and if we assume that Israel in some capacity spent time or basically grew out of Egypt, and we look at the time frame, roughly 1440 to 1270, somewhere in there, they were in Egypt. There was something happened in Egypt, and a group of people came out who then became Israel. That is over 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. So if you have any, if you picture the Israelites building the pyramids, sorry, that is not quite correct by quite a long margin. And but I think sometimes popular culture doesn't do a good job to that. We watch Hollywood movies, and then sometimes it gives us this impression that, Israelites were there in this high time and they built all these mega structures. But really, I think what we should think about is the pyramids were already an old story at that point. Obviously, they were standing and obviously quite imposing, but they were still in use, so still there were tombs in there, but they had been robbed before already. They had been robbed of all their whatever expensive materials. So it was an old story. We are closer to Martin Luther and the Reformation than the Israelites were to the building of the pyramids. But on the other hand, this is old. It was old news at that point, but imagine yourself being an Israelite, and you are the descendant of immigrants into Egypt, and you grow up in Egypt. You are told, my heritage is not Egyptian. I am, son or daughter of some immigrant, but you live in this country or this empire that builds something like the pyramids or all the temples that we've seen. It carves massive temples into the mountainside. What kind of impression would that leave on you as an immigrant? Not a rhetorical question. I wouldn't mind some feedback.
Give you an idea of perhaps the power of the place where you live.
So probably deeply impressed, right? Very much. What might this impression, this, I guess, a certain awe, what might that do to you culturally, or like to your narrative of being your heritage as an immigrant? Might that actually impact you, like impact your story? Yeah.
Say it. About 10 years ago, my parents, they went to Malta, and I didn't realize till after they got back that it was a place where Paul went.
Right.
And they showed me pictures of just the cities and towns and the churches, and it's so different from here. Like it's all like stone carved churches, and if I was to think of that as an immigrant, it's just like in awe. Like, and one of the things I also think about is like, I like to learn about the guy who first found this stone to carve.
Right.
And the I don't know what that word is. But the person that went out and found the stone. Oh yeah, this stone is perfect for
a cornerstone or something. Yeah.
And whatnot, especially at that era.
Yeah.
You know, that's one thing I think about.
Right. So massive awe, in regard to these achievements that have been made, and dare I say, it can't but influence you. It can't not impact your own story. But then the question is, how does it impact your story? Do you just? I think in essence, the Israelites faced these immigrants, not just the Israelites, but the Israelites are the ones that I guess we're most interested in, faced a similar dilemma to what we face today when we learn about those times, or when we learn about something that doesn't quite fit into how we have understood things traditionally. Fight, flight, or insight. They would have had a chance. Do I fight this? Do I fight this powerful culture? Because perhaps, even the Bible states it became very oppressive. Do I fight this? Do I disregard all the achievements that the Egyptians have had over, thousands of years already at that time? Or do I just give in entirely? Do I just blend in? I just become one of them? I, just kind of let go of my own heritage because this is obviously the much cooler people. I want to be part of this powerful people instead. Or is there a third way? Is there a way of understanding? Here's a powerful people. Is there something we can learn from them? Is there something that we can benefit from? And then take that and make that part of your own heritage. And then later you leave, or your descendants leave this place, and you actually take something of value with you, rather than just going empty-handed because you have just put up walls the whole time. So that's perhaps an idea or an angle that I like to come from. So with that, let's actually read some Egyptian literature. So all of this would have been hieroglyphs, which 200 years ago nobody could read, and now we can. So let's do it. So first up, let's actually read the hymn to the Authen, which should be in your pack. It should be the first one. So this is not the full hymn to the Authen. It is actually much more extensive than this, but this gives us a good taste of what it sounds like. So let's read from the top of page 276 there. As you, Authen, rise over the horizon, your beauty, giver of life, is revealed. You rise in the east, you fill the land with beauty. Your glory shines high above the land. Your rays enrich the land you have created. O Re, other name for Authen, You reach to the ends of the earth. You bestow these lands on Akhenaten, your beloved son. Although you are far away, your rays touch the earth. Although you shine on every human face, no one sees you. When you set upon the western horizon, the earth lies in darkness and death. Sleepers lie beneath the covers, seeing no one around them. Their belongings under their pillows could vanish. They would not even notice. The lion leaves his cave. The snake strikes when darkness blankets the land. The lands are quiet. The Creator rests on the horizon. At daybreak, you rise again over the horizon. You shine as the Authen bringing day. Your rays chase away the darkness. The two lands of Egypt rejoice. Again, upper, lower Egypt, rejoice. Awake and erect, you raise them up. Bathed and dressed, they raise their hands in praise. The whole land goes to work. Cattle graze content, trees and plants turn green. Birds fly to their nest and spread their wings to praise you, Ka. All things that walk or fly come to life when you have risen. Ships and barges sail up and down. Canals open at your rising. Fish glide through the river. Your rays penetrate even dark waters. You join a woman and a man. You massage the fetus in the mother's womb. You soothe the crying child unborn. You nurse the hungry infant in the womb. You breathe into its nostrils the first breath of life. You open the newborn's mouth on the day of its birth. You meet every human need. So that's a piece of the hymn to the Authen. And if you have paid attention on the right side of your copy, you can see that there it says Psalms 104. So that's the separate copy that I gave you. And let's now read the Psalm 104 and see if there is any similarity there. So I'm just going to read just because the recording device is here so that later on, was it prosperity? Whatever. People can, understand what I'm saying. What's the word, Levi, that I'm looking for? It's not prosperity.
Carl knows.
Yeah. Posterity. There we go. I don't mind prosperity, but whatever. All right, so here's Psalm 104. So let's see if we can compare these two. Praise the Lord, my soul. Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. The Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers on their waters. He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. He makes winds his messengers, flames of fire his servants. He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths of the garment. The waters stood above the mountains. But at your rebuke, the waters fled, and the sound of your thunder they took to flight. They flowed over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, to the place you assigned for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. He makes springs pour water into the ravines. It flows between the mountains. They give water to all the beasts of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky nest by the waters. They sing among the branches. The waters of the mountains from his upper chambers. The land is satisfied by the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for the people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth. Wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their face shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. The trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of the Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nest. The stork has its home in the junipers. The high mountains belong to the wild goats. The crags are a refuge for the hyrax. He made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. You bring darkness, it becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. The sun rises, and they steal away. They return to lie down in their dens. Then people go out to do their work, to their labor until evening. How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. All creatures look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to dust. When you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord all my life. I will sing praise to my God as long as I live. May my meditation be pleasing to him as I rejoice in the Lord. But may sinners vanish from the earth and the wicked be no more. Praise the Lord, my soul. Praise the Lord. What a beautiful, beautiful psalm. Did anything stick out to you if you compare these two texts, the hymn to the Authen and Psalm 104?
Yeah, certainly a bit about the creatures coming out.
Right.
And then returning.
Right.
There's a bit more description in the Authen, but it's like the same.
Right. There's definitely a similar theme in both, right? Just for those who are listening, what's your name again?
Colin.
Colin pointed out that there's a similar theme in both, that the creatures are dependent on God and that they come and go, go to sleep and come out during the day as per God's design, basically. And this is discussed in both these texts. Other thoughts? I think there's lots. Yes.
Who is Authen?
Authen is we talked about the monotheistic period in Egypt. Authen is the name of that god, the one god that they would worship.
Is it the same god that we worship?
There's an excellent question. That's I guess the question that I was a bit throwing into the room. Is it possible that immigrants into Egypt inspired this pharaoh to do away with polytheism and only center around this one god that he got to know in some capacity? Or was it perhaps the other way around? Was this pharaoh inspired monotheism into the people who later ventured out of Egypt? So there's tons of discussion to be had. But excellent question.
There's a lot of parallels between the two. Like, there's phrases in one that are almost identical in the other.
Right.
And so you're wondering if one or the other influenced the writing, or maybe it was partially a copy of something that was there.
Right. So parallel phrases. And I think we immediately, or at least I'm also like that, I immediately start to question, which came first? Which was the original? Who copied from whom? And that can be could be a thing. Perhaps in that case, we might conclude perhaps Hebrews would copy from Egyptians because Egyptian culture has been a lot stronger for a lot longer. But it doesn't necessarily have to go that way at all. But very good questions there. What do these parallels mean? Is that, was there an influence, if not copying, but was there an influence? And perhaps this is already pointing into the direction. Perhaps this is a sign of Hebrews taking what was useful out of Egypt and taking it with them. Yes?
I think honestly, like it's all connected in some way, like especially with Egyptians, like the way they built their pyramids, and going forward from that, even before that, it evolved into the way we build today.
Right.
Of course, we have a larger scale of tools, and but I think it's all connected in some way, like. And like we learned all this studying all like the hieroglyphics and everything that has been discovered. There's a reason why, we wanted to discover that so we can learn from it, right?
Right.
So there's, I think everything's connected in some way.
Right.
There's no, of course, from Christianity we believe that, everything evolves from God.
Right.
Right. So there's always something there to connect everything.
Right. So I think you're hinting at all truth is God's truth. So is that
in a way
where you're hinting at?
In a way, but also considering that it's scientific stuff too, right? I mean, there's an origin of that scientific stuff. Maybe for lack of better words, may not be from God, but a human discoveries as well. I mean, there's a reason for that.
Yeah. Very good thought. I like it. Christian.
Maybe something that is contrasting between the two. Reading the hymn to the Authen, it's kind of hard to tell if there's a difference between Authen and the sun.
Right.
So Authen does a lot of things that a sun does.
Yep, the sun.
And so it's almost like it's the same thing versus Psalm 104, specifically verse 22. The psalmist makes a clear distinction between God and the sun.
Right. Very, very well noticed there. That is one of the unique features, actually, about the Old Testament, is that it's quite subversive in its message. There's a lot of similarity between, in this case, Egyptian literature and Hebrew literature, and as we discussed last time, a lot of overlap between ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian literature and Hebrew. And yet one of the distinguishing features is that while there's similar language, there's never worship of a thing, of a celestial body, of the moon, of the sun, or anything like that. It basically, in other cultures, the sun, oftentimes it is the sun, because ancient people knew that it is life-giving and that it is important for the circle of life. They would worship this, and they would identify the sun as being some kind of manifestation of a god or some kind of deity. Versus the Hebrews, the sun is never personalized. The sun never has an identity. It is just a thing. It is a created thing. The moon is a created thing, but they don't even have personalities. They are entirely demythologized in that sense. So even if you read the creation account, last time we have not really read creation accounts in Babylon, but there, sun, moon, and stars all have, they impersonate some kind of deity. Similar also in Egypt. Here we have a glaring example of that. The Authen is basically the sun. However, in Israel, not at all the case. So, we wanted to continue this discussion, but I want to release you from your chairs for a little bit. Let's have a little stretcher, a little break, perhaps 5 to 10 minutes. We have some Timbits, some water, some muffins, a bit of refreshment. And perhaps we get going again 8:15 at the latest-ish.
Is school till 9?
Usually our plan is to go 7 to 8. We'll be like...
That's what I meant.
Yes, so we cover... we try to break new ground between 7 and 8. And then after that, people can stick around for discussions.
Okay.
So
the study is from 7 to 8 and discussion is...
8 to 9.
8 to 9?
Yes.
Within groups or open?
It's going to be... I like it being open, so even if there's groups, maybe there's going to be short phases where the groups can talk a little bit, and then we share out in the open, yes.
Did I miss something crucial last week?
I covered what I found was crucial from last week. The first, basically our goal, what we want to do with this, and the archaeology piece, what was different 200 years ago to now.
Yeah.
That's basically what I consider is essential for both.
So what was the goal
The goal is to try and understand the Bible as best we can. And particularly, with these first 3 sessions, it's going to be highlighting the human element in the Bible. Like we actually realize, the Bible isn't written in a vacuum. It is very much influenced by the empires, the people, the cultures of the day, right?
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, yeah.
It's been that way for 50 years.
So what? Do you think people were both here?
I mean, it's Canada, the conservatives go get something more secret. You see what it's like.
And when you do this, then you split the group of them, and then this one went.
Alberta is the most similar
Was designed secular and the government just were not whatever
almost different countries. I just the states and so it's
nowadays it is like in Canada it's more as it states here provinces compared to the government
Pharaoh media is typically practice. Then they do it sometime over the mean the first or the second. I never even know where I think it says I think they agree with Christian scholars believe and he's maybe this is silly reason, but he's the only kind of like elements of system. Yeah, so that's kind of an odd reason. I'm okay buying a $30 I'd rather do that. Oh, you split under like half of bread.
All right. Okie dokie. This can go down. So let's get back into it before we get too tired and distracted. So I believe the next one we have in there is the 30 Teachings of Ope. Is that true? If you flip the page. So, funny names aside, this is a very interesting text. I quoted this on one Sunday morning. I don't know if you remember. And I think this will sound quite familiar to us as well. So let's start with teaching 1. So again, there's 30, and we will only read the first 3, basically. Let's see what it sounds like. Teaching 1. Listen to what I say. Learn my words by heart. Prosperity, this time it's really prosperity, comes to those who keep my words in their hearts. Poverty comes to those who discard them. Enshrine my words in your souls. Lock them away in your hearts. When the words of fools blow like a storm, the words of the wise will hold your tongue like an anchor. Live your lives with the words in your heart, and you will live your lives with success. My words are a handbook for your life on earth. My words will bring your body to life. Teaching 2. Do not steal from the poor. Do not cheat the cripple. Do not abuse the elderly. Do not refuse to let the aged speak. Do not conspire to defraud anyone yourself. Do not encourage anyone else's fraud. Do not sue those who wrong you. Do not testify against them in court. Injustice can turn on fools quicker than floods eroding the bank of a canal, north winds bearing down on a boat, storms forming, or thunderbolts cracking, or crocodiles striking. Fools cry out, fools shout to the divine assembly for help. Let Thoth, divine patron of the moon, judge their crimes. You must steer the boat to rescue them. Do not treat fools the way fools treat you. Pull the fools up out of the water. Give the fool your hand. Leave the punishment of the fool to the divine assembly. Feed fools until they are full. Give them your bread until they are ashamed. Teaching 3. Stop and think before you speak. It is a quality pleasing to the divine assembly. Never quarrel with fools, nor cast barbed words at them. Stay patient when confronted by enemies. Bend like the wind when attacked. Sleep before answering their accusations. Anger explodes in fools, like fire breaks out in straw. Stay out of the way of angry fools. Let the divine assembly judge them. Keep my words in your heart. Be a model for your children. So, those are the first 3 teachings. Now, since we sit in groups, maybe we can take advantage of that. So perhaps there are some people who are more comfortable sharing in a smaller setting. Maybe take some time to reflect on this. I don't have a parallel text printed for you because that would be several and it would take a lot of time reading through all of them. But take some time in your groups to see, is there anything here that sounds familiar, perhaps to the parallel texts that are mentioned next to it. So most of it's out of Proverbs. And go.
That's foolish.
I don't know if Proverbs actually.
Well, that's the introduction to Proverbs 17. Proverbs.
I think it's fascinating to see that Proverbs was the this is the fear of the Lord is wise
I believe so. I can't say that conclusively. It would usually be, writings would be attested to a pharaoh usually. So it would be royalty, if not the pharaoh himself, who would claim to write things, or things would be written in their name.
The original readers actually thought of it when they thought about faith, when they received it as like,
Maybe one more minute.
Yeah.
All right, maybe finish up your points, your arguments. All right. I'm very excited that this, group setting really worked, that people are really engaging in their particular discussions. So what I would like to do now is to draw out what was significant at your table. What kind of observations have you drawn?
I think one of the things that came out is that, again, looking at it against those lines that are highlighted against the Proverbs, again, there's those similarities, but there seems to be a lot less than there was in the
previous one.
Yeah. So whether that is, one is taken from the other or compared to the other, or it's just that they're a topic that people are expressing in the same way but totally apart.
So there's some overlap, but not as much?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes?
Well, for me, there's direct parallel, and it's so much of the same, but so these Egyptians have the same brain as other people, and the knowledge comes to them from whoever they think it comes from, where we know it comes from God. But for them, doing what the teachings say, what are the consequences?
Mm-hmm.
We know what our consequences are as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what their consequences, what they... This is interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, in the back.
Isn't this something of an anthropological question?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Can you expand that a little bit?
What was the question?
So, in which way is this anthropological? Can you explain that?
The convergence or the divergence, as it were, or if you wish to go mainline.
Right.
Those answers are not forthcoming.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you can examine it from the point of view of deity separate, or however you choose to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Anthropologically speaking, if you were to remove the God factor from, ad arguendum, then it becomes an anthropological issue.
Mm-hmm.
Just mix it.
Right.
I don't have any answers because I wasn't there.
Right, yeah. Good point. So we had the observation that, I guess depending on how you look at it, there's more or less overlap compared to the previous text we saw. And then the observation that this is very much an anthropological issue. Because we have two people groups who have very similar understanding of what wisdom is. And if these people groups have quite obviously a history together, at least for some time, then humans do what humans do, right? So there has been an adaptation. I think that kind of goes without saying, right?
There's no answer to the chicken or egg conundrum.
Right.
You said it first, we don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no conclusion, no conclusive answer as to, who has come up with this wisdom. Yes?
So, talking about the parallels, and then also what was on the screen before about did this guy inspire these people or did these people inspire that guy? It's parallel to a psalm,
Mm-hmm.
which is a Jewish teaching, and from a Christian perspective, okay, which of these people inspired these people? They both failed. So, God has, and I would say that Christians are in the midst of still failing.
Right.
And God is constantly trying to get His wisdom into us.
Right.
And get us on the right track. And so, God's been around trying to help us figure it out. And we keep on failing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like that very much. That the idea that revelation, that God is revealing Himself, not just in what we read in the Bible, but a ton of it also outside of it. And a lot of it to us is now we go and be like, oh, what? God was here already? We read about it, this ancient culture, and somehow, oftentimes, we come with the assumption that, this is must be some kind of deep and very messed up culture because, it's not Israel, not the holy people. And then we realize, dang it, they seem to have things figured out at least as much, right? If not more. And so that I find that extremely encouraging, that God is present everywhere, right? We can't go anywhere where God hasn't been all along. So that's quite a very good observation there. I like that. Other tables. Now, in terms of chicken or egg, I'm inclined towards one side of that because, here, I guess the most obvious parallel is Proverbs, the structure of Proverbs, the general message of Proverbs, of teaching wisdom, educating the next generation, basically. And who does the Bible generally ascribe wisdom to? There are many authors also acknowledged in the Bible, but one is kind of the go-to, guy spewing wisdom. Who is that? Solomon. Now, who famously married the Pharaoh's daughter? Solomon. Solomon entered marriage with the daughter of the Pharaoh, which was a strategic marriage in his case, and he very much benefited from that, both economically and militarily, and now there was peace between Israel and in Egypt. Because remember, there was this late Bronze Age collapse where Egypt was very weak. And within that time, and into that time, fits basically the whole story of the Israelite monarchy, the time of Israel's monarchy, which is, let's say, it's Israel's high time. When Israel was most united, they were growing, expanding. And now Egypt is on the rise again, or is still there. And Egypt has always controlled that area in which Israel now resides. So one way of making sure the Pharaoh is okay with that now there's a new people in charge, is marrying his daughter. And what could, apart from Israel coming out of Egypt, now there's yet another overlap and another influence, because the princess for sure did not travel to Israel to be the wife by herself. There was a whole entourage. So if there's, and then we read about Solomon actually coming into trouble, right? Into troublesome waters, because this was not his only wife. This was one of very many. And yet, it seems like God always does, he makes lemonade out of lemons. So whatever is useful, whatever these Egyptian people eat, like either what the Israelites brought out of Egypt or what later got imported into Canaan or into Israel with an Egyptian entourage, the best of that was kept, and it was recognized as, this is useful. This seems to be true. So why would we reject that? Oh, that's Egyptian. That's all garbage. They were actually taking that and be like, you know what? This sounds a lot like how we know our God to be. What we know our God to be like. So it is incorporated, and I find that's very encouraging. It's a learning mentality. So I very much like that. Yes.
I have an observation more than for me growing up and hearing Bible stories from the time I was like a kid in Sunday school and youth group and catechism, whatever.
Right.
I always viewed the Egyptians as evil.
Right.
Because of they threw the babies into the Nile River. They demanded this. The Israelites were their slaves. So I viewed them as completely evil people.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like I read this and then I hear, there's maybe that is not an accurate thought.
Right.
And then what does that mean? How does that impact the rest of the stories? How does that change my belief of the culture? When I viewed them as just, these are evil people and the Israelites had to run away and escape, maybe that changes the dynamic of the story as well. So, yeah.
Thanks for that observation, very much so. Similar feelings for me as well. Like, what the heck? The Egyptians make sense. And they, and they have like these deep insights and true wisdom that I'm like, I want to be like that. Well, that's all of a sudden it's like, how do you hold these two together? But I think that's how complex life sometimes is, right? We have powerful regimes, powerful empires, and a lot of it can be evil, but not everything is evil. Dare I say, nothing is ever entirely evil. It's never evil enough that God can't draw anything good out of it. And I think that this can be another example of that. Okay, yes?
Innovative. They came up with the papyrus that had to write, waterproof. Crocodiles didn't like it at all. Makeup, cosmetics, they were very innovative in their way of thinking, so broad and vast. And why does God choose one culture to be more, not powerful, but have more going on, not more wisdom, but, and one more primitive, like, how does he let that be? Because they had a lot of input into so much.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you're touching on something that I kind of mentioned in the beginning. One of the reasons why Egypt was as powerful as it was is because of the Nile. Like most of these ancient civilizations were kind of drawing their life, that their life source is some kind of water body. Usually it's a river. In this case, the Nile is exceptionally steady and predictable in how it floods.
And their building, their way of measuring, it's just
phenomenal. But
God allowed them to be that way.
Exactly.
For a reason.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that was not just to their own benefit. It was, it benefited the people. That there was a reason why there was immigrants into Egypt, right? They weren't captives. They went there because there was safety there. There was security there. There was order that wasn't where they lived. Canaan was always fought between Babylon and Egypt. And then eventually they're like, you know what, might as well go to either pick a party and then go and join their team kind of thing, right? So you go there and you live there. And that's the same thing that happens today, right? We have areas of conflict around the world. And what happens to the people? As much as they like their place, they see better opportunities leaving that behind and going to a place where there's more prosperity, where there's more order. And that is a very driving theme, I believe. Very good observation there. Should we take on the last one? This one, the one Canaanite-ish text that I have. Let me see. Here we go. So this is the treaty between Ramesses II and Hattusilus III. And let's see what this sounds familiar to. Perhaps not as familiar, not as directly overlapping, but I believe similar patterns. So this is a treaty, so we're reading treaty language. First, we have the credentials. Inscribed on this silver tablet is the treaty creating peace and eternal alliance between Hattusilus, the great king of Hatti. Those who were here last time, you might remember the Hatti period in the Babylonian timeline. So this was a northwestern area or region within the larger region of Babylon, and the power shifted for a time to that region. So the Hatti people, the Hittites, were at that time the powerful nation. And the background story to this is a long war between the Hatti and the Egyptians. So eternal peace between Hattusilus, the great king of Hatti, son of Morsalis, the great king of Hatti, grandson of, that's a good name, Supiluliamas, great king of Hatti, so many great kings of Hatti, and Ramesses, Pharaoh of Egypt, son of Seti, Pharaoh of Egypt, son of Ramesses, Pharaoh of Egypt. So those are the credentials. Then the background. In the beginning, the divine assembly decreed that there be peace between Pharaoh of Egypt and the great king of Hatti. Then Muwatallis, the brother of the great king of Hatti, declared war on Ramesses. From this day forward, Hattusilus will observe the decree of Re and Seth, which prohibits war between Egypt and Hatti forever. The terms of the treaty. Hattusilus agrees to this treaty with Ramesses, creating peace and an eternal alliance between us. We are brothers and are at peace with each other forever. I, Hattusilus, came to the throne of Hatti when Muwatallis died. Therefore, I agree to this treaty with Ramesses, creating peace and alliance between us. The state of peace and alliance between our lands is now better than in its former times. I, Ramesses, agree to the peace and alliance. The successors of the great king of Hatti will be allies with the successor of Ramesses. The relationship between Egypt and Hatti shall be like our relationship, one of peace and eternal alliance. There will be never again war between us. The non-aggression pact. In the future, the great king of Hatti shall neither invade nor raid Egypt. Ramesses shall neither invade nor raid Hatti. I, Hattusalis, reaffirmed the treaties of, Supi Lulyamas and Muwattalis, great king of Hatti, kings of Hatti. And I, Ramesses, affirm the treaty I made with Hattusalis this day, and will observe it and act accordingly from now on. Now the defense. If a foreign army invades the lands of Ramesses, and he sends a message to the great king of Hatti, saying, "Come and help me against this enemy," the great king of Hatti shall come and fight against the enemy of Egypt and his ally. If the great king of Hatti does not wish to come personally, he may send infantry and chariots to fight against the enemy of Egypt, his ally. Likewise, if Ramesses is trying to put down an armed revolt, the great king of Hatti shall help him until all the rebels have been executed. If a foreign army attacks the great king of Hatti, Ramesses shall come and fight against the enemy of Hatti to aid his ally. If Ramesses does not wish to come personally, he may send infantry and chariots as well as word to his effect to Hatti. Then the succession. When Hattusalis dies, the son of Hattusalis shall be crowned great king of Hatti in his father's place. If the people of Hatti revolt against his son, Ramesses shall send soldiers and chariots to protect the son of Hattusalis. Once order has been restored in Hatti, they shall return to Egypt. Extradition. If one or even two, it's an interesting detail, one or even two powerful Egyptians or anyone from Egypt at all seeks asylum in Hatti, the great king shall extradite them to Ramesses, Pharaoh of Egypt. If one or even two powerful Hittites or anyone from Hatti seeks asylum in Egypt, Pharaoh shall extradite them to the great king of Hatti. Then the list of witnesses, and we won't read them all. Thousands of divine patrons of Hatti and Egypt are witnesses to the treaty between the great king of Hatti and Ramesses inscribed on the silver tablet. And then there's a list of at least 20 here. And the last piece, I don't think you have on your copies. This is the litany of curses and blessings. The household, lands, and slaves of those who do not observe the treaty between Hatti and Egypt, inscribed in this silver tablet, will be cursed by the divine assembly of Hatti and Egypt. So you're cursed by two divine assemblies. Better don't. The households, lands, and slaves of those Egyptians and Hittites who observe and carry out faithfully the treaty between Egypt and Hatti, inscribed in this silver tablet, will be blessed in the divine assemblies of Hatti and Egypt with prosperity and long life. So, there's nothing that is exactly parallel to this. But is there similar language here? Is there a pattern in this treaty that sounds somewhat familiar to things we have in the Bible? I think I'll leave this one in plenary. Yes?
Question. Where is it? It was talking about Pharaoh in Egypt. Was this just before that time when the Israelites came to Egypt? Was it before that? I guess it was before that time.
It would be around that time.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Sounds a lot like the covenants.
Right.
The covenants in the Bible.
Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah, there's a bunch of different covenants, and they're all different types, and so the language though was the same in a lot of them, where there's a promise made and a promise made back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the wording is similar. The order of things, like the defense, succession, like what will happen. This, just is just similar language to all the covenants.
Right, covenantal language, very much so. Yeah, I agree. So we have the different segments in a covenant that we find very similarly, a similar structure in many covenants in the Bible. They're never exactly the same, but the similar pieces pop up in all of these. Mainly, who are the parties who are entering a covenant. Then the covenant stipulations, what are we committing to? And then in the Bible, very prominently, and here not so much, curses and blessings. So here it's just, if you don't, be cursed by 2 divine assemblies. Multiple gods, will curse you. Maybe they didn't need more detail than that, but in the Bible, there is tons of detail as to how exactly you shall be cursed. I guess, is it mostly in Deuteronomy? There's lots of covenant language there. It goes into a lot of detail. We know what's going to happen if you don't keep to this covenant. On the other hand, also a lot of blessing language. Keep this covenant, and here is this will be your trajectory. And that becomes kind of the mojo for the Israelites, right? That's what's supposed to motivate them, is this language of blessing. We want to be on the blessing side of things. So we want to stay in that line. We want to keep this covenant. Perfect observation. Yes?
I think it's interesting too, when you look at the biblical covenants and, weird things happen, smoldering pot, and you learn about the culture of where that all comes from. There's always a reason for it, and it comes from these cultures, and so the connections are so intricate, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess the conclusion is covenant language is not something unique to the Bible. It is very much, it's a day-to-day diplomatic language of its time. So, and that's what now the Israelites, they enter a diplomatic covenant with God. And it is framed in this kind of political language, or at least it would be the same as political language of its time. Yeah, very much. Other observations?
On that note about covenant language,
yeah.
I'm also just thinking about Moses going and pleading on behalf of the Israelites that God keep his covenant with them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots in this where I'm imagining somebody from one or the other of these sides being like, remember this thing that you signed? It's written down here,
mm-hmm.
but then the reality of that comes in of you actually have to.
It can be messy.
Yeah,
yep.
you have to convince the other side, remember, my dad signed this thing.
Right.
We have to be nice to each other.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, and even in the covenant, we have already part of the stipulations is you better tell your son.
Right.
Even if you were the one signing it, it also includes your descendants, right? And the same thing again also in the Bible, right? There's your descendants shall live like this. It's not just for now. This is a thing that this is supposed to be from now on. So yeah, I like that. Awesome. I think we're doing a great job in walking walking this balanced view of Scripture, and I hope a session like today and like last time is encouraging to you and is pokes your interest a little bit as to in which way have all these ancient cultures painted the picture, or they kind of color the picture that is ancient Israel. If we want to picture it like that, ancient Israel is kind of like a black and white thing, and now these ancient cultures come in and they bring color into it, and now we see how they all contribute. A, B, how God has been present all along in all those other nations as well, and I find that's very powerful and very encouraging to me. If I look at our world today, I think that's the message, or a message that is very much needed today. That we can acknowledge, yes, there's a lot of messed upness in this world. There's a lot that's gone awry. But God is still in all of it. There's still beauty in all of it. There's still truth in all of it. We just have to, we can expect that. But it takes work to find it. It takes effort and intentionality to go and look for it. So that's perhaps a challenge and encouragement that I would like to leave you guys with for tonight. last time I did mention that the Code of Hammurabi is also a very interesting piece of literature. Not Egyptian, obviously. This is Babylonian. That sadly we couldn't cover because of time, but I have attached a copy to your handout. Again, that's not the whole Code of Hammurabi. It's pretty long, but it gives you kind of a taste for it. So last time we covered flood stories, mostly, of ancient Mesopotamia. So creation narratives and flood stories, that's kind of where there's a lot of overlap between Israel and Babylon. And law-giving as well. So you will find there's quite similar language between the Code of Hammurabi. And the intention of that code is to establish justice and order, which is kind of the baseline also or is the intention for the laws for Israel. It's supposed to be a just society, and quite counterintuitive to some of the people around. And today then we covered wisdom literature, and have seen an overlap there. So just to kind of try and point out to you, that this is how we try to cover different genres of the Bible and see how there's overlap. Cool. Thank you guys so much for sticking around, and I hope to see as many of you as possible, and maybe more. Tell your friends to come again next time when we will dig into the intertestamental period. I call it Greco-Roman because, but what we will not do is, study Greek history and Roman history, because that would be impossible. But what we will do is see now we will kind of center around Israel through that time when first Greek influence is heavy because they're taken over by Alexander the Great, and then later Roman. Just as an outlook for next time. That was a question.
Yeah. Are your PowerPoints, are we able to get a copy of your PowerPoints?
I can sure make those available, for sure.
I would love to get a PowerPoint.
Absolutely. I don't like to dismiss people. Instead, I would like to send people. Be encouraged, be intrigued, I hope I can stir a little bit of interest and of encouragement in you, and that's how I would like to send you from here. Amen.